Hello everyone, this is the first of 3 videos introducing you to some basic rhetorical concepts. In this video we'll consider the basic components of any rhetorical situation: author, audience, text, subject, and context. First, however, I'd like to go over something that you may have already seen before, which is the idea that compositions have purposes. In other words, they often intend to make some sort of specific impact on their audience. Now, this is taught in a lot of different ways, but one way to start thinking about the purpose of a composition is to consider what the author, and that may be you, is trying to accomplish. What is the intended effect that you're looking for? Again, there are many approaches to this out there, but my argument is that all compositions are essentially persuasive in one of 3 ways, or some combination of them. Sometimes we're taught that persuasive writing is its own thing, and that informative or entertaining compositions have other purposes. I think that it's all persuasive, and here's why. In the typical persuasive text or argument, the author's purpose is to get the reader to agree with a particular point. That's pretty straightforward. However, if you think about it, even entertainment and information have to be persuasive in their own ways. For example, if you are writing a horror novel and you want your readers to be very horrified, your text has to persuade them to feel that way. Similarly, if you're composing a love song and you want your audience to feel that deep sentiment, you have to work to get them to feel it. Even with texts wherein the purpose is to inform, you still have to persuade your audience to believe you. In that case, if you don't at least communicate credibility, you might find that your text, as full of facts as it may be, just isn't as effective as you'd like. In this video, we'll be focusing primarily on the terminology related to what we call a rhetorical situation. Understanding precise terms will help us break down complex texts and better analyze them, and it will also help us better approach the process of composition ourselves. What is rhetoric? It's a word that's bandied about quite often, usually in some political context, but what does it really mean? What have you come to understand it to mean? If you want, you could pause the video here and do a little bit of free writing. That may help you to contextualize your existing ideas about this stuff and reflect on how my approach to explaining it helps deepen your understanding, or not. So this is going to seem a bit contrived, but I'm going to go ahead and ask anyway. What is it called when someone chooses his or her words and actions with very careful calculation in order to get somebody else to do what they want? Well, some of you may be thinking, manipulation. That's maybe a nasty word, but let's consider what we're really talking about here. You, as an author, are trying to persuade an audience whether to agree, feel, or believe something. You are making an effort to get your reader to do what you want them to do, and you're going to use the composition to do it. Now, let's not assume that manipulation is necessarily a bad thing. Yes, it is often used to describe situations wherein someone is taking advantage of someone or engaging in some other questionably ethical behavior, but manipulate has its etymological root in the Latin word manus, which means hand. To manipulate something is to get in there and shape something the way you want it to be shaped, artfully or skillfully. Whether or not your purpose is shady is beside the point. With rhetoric, you can try to manipulate your audience like a sculptor manipulating a hunk of clay. Let's put this into perspective so as to avoid any digressive philosophical rabbit holes. Let's consider the situation here with this young man. Now, I just want to preface this example by saying that I'm not trying to generalize about people who like Metallica or metal, or people with long hair or ripped clothes, etc. I actually probably looked a lot like that at times in my life, to be honest, but it would have been a Pink Floyd shirt. But anyway, I digress. This just happened to be the rock band logo I thought I was best prepared to sketch for this context, so bear with me. Anyway, let's imagine that this young man here is going in for a job interview at, let's say, a bank. Now, regardless of his meticulous accounting skills or deep instinctive knowledge about the workings of the stock market, I think a lot of us would agree that this may not be the most effective way of communicating a message about himself to his audience. This is a rhetorical situation because there is an intended communication at work with an author, an audience, a context, and a kind of presentation of details or ideas. In this situation, it isn't just the crumpled resume that's the text. The text is his whole presence, including how he presents himself. By the way, after I drew this, I animated this, I realized that the interviewer isn't wearing a shirt, but, whatever. Let's go ahead and look at the components of the rhetorical situation. There's an author, whoever is creating the text. There's an audience, to whom the author's message is directed. I'd also throw in that what this slide doesn't say is that there can always be unintended audiences as well. So a given rhetorical situation doesn't necessarily involve the intended audience. As you begin rhetorically analyzing texts, you'll find that how effective they are has a lot to do with the specific audiences the texts are reaching. That is admittedly abstract, but I think that the examples we'll look at will help to ground what I just said. Anyway, in addition to author and audience, we have a subject, in other words, what the message is about. Then we have a text. Now, I'd like to take just a few seconds to clarify that a text, rhetorically speaking, doesn't necessarily even involve words. I know that usually when we hear the word text, it's in reference to a book, like a textbook, or some other written source, like a text message. But a text could be anything that contains a message, from a symbol on a bumper sticker to a particular tune on a brass instrument to a series of characters entered into a video game chat. We'll get into the form and content of texts in the next video in this series. And finally, we have the context, which is a term that most of us likely more or less understand, but in rhetoric can be pretty complex and tricky because, well, primarily because there's always so much going on. In essence, context is whatever is going on externally and yet impacts the interactions between the other components of the rhetorical situation. Now I'm going to throw some triangles at you. This approach to rhetoric goes back to classical Greek philosophy, Aristotle in particular, who discussed the rhetorical appeals logos, ethos, and pathos. As you may know, these Greek words are related to a number of modern English words: logos, logic; ethos, ethic; pathos, empathy or sympathy, or just plain pathetic. And those connections are themselves helpful in wrapping our brains around the rhetorical situation, but not enough on their own. In the case of these diagrams, consider that you could basically split the little one in the center into two ways of interpreting this approach to the study of rhetoric. On the one hand, at left, we can see a more detailed description of how these appeals work, but we'll focus on that aspect in a later video. For now, let's look at the right side, which deals with textual relationships in a given rhetorical situation. Here we've got 4 of the 5 components, context is excluded here, and these arrows just indicate that there exist relationships between some of the components that are worth looking into in order to determine what approaches to composition might have what impacts. For example, what is the relationship between author and reader? Are they complete strangers? Do they share interests or viewpoints? Do they know each other? The connection between author and reader has a lot to do with what kind of textual content will be most effective. Similarly, you have the author's attitude towards the subject and the reader's attitude towards the subject. These may be similar and they may be different. Just how different they are may have a lot to do with how effective the author's text is going to have to be in order to persuade the reader, because ultimately the author's goal is to get the reader's attitude towards the subject to more or less align with theirs. Again, think back to the horror novel situation I proposed near the beginning of this video. If you're writing a scary story and your attitude towards the subject as the author is that the novel is scary, you ultimately want your reader to agree with that. If your text isn't effective, they might just end up laughing about how stupid and cheesy it is that the crocodile hologram ate its own tail and short-circuited just when the protagonist was jumping out of the way of the zombie unicorn. Sorry, I got a little sidetracked there. Point is, as the author, you want to work on your text so that it affects the reader toward your purpose as best as possible. One way an author can go about doing this is by establishing these relationships to the best of their ability. This can be very challenging, of course, especially because language is itself a malleable thing. Meanings can change easily and quickly. Words can mean any number of different things to different people, so it can be difficult to nail these things down. But we don't have to be perfect. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's apply this stuff to the situation with the Metallica guy. He's the author. His text is not, as I said, just the shirt or the resume, but the entire package, from his presentation to attire to language use. It's a complex and multimedia text, really. That's kind of why job interviews are so terrifying, right? All of it together comprises the container of the message, which is about getting a job. More or less, I'm applying for a job and you should hire me. And you've got Mr. I don't have to wear a shirt at my job interviewer. Now this is as oversimplified as my stick figure drawings, but I hope you get the point. So let's look at textual relationship. The author thinks, I want the job, I'm qualified, I'm going to get it, that kind of thing. The reader, on the other hand, by way of the text not being as effective as it could be, is probably thinking something different about the idea of hiring this person. Again, this isn't to say that wearing a shirt with holes in it is going to mean you're not going to get a job. It's just that in this specific situation, with this specific audience, and in the specific context of a bank, which is typically a pretty formal place, the message as composed is probably not going to fly. Perhaps going into a different hiring context in the same attire with the same approach would work, someplace where the style expectations are different. But in this context, let's just say there might be a problem with the text. To review, a rhetorical situation is comprised of an author, an audience, and a subject. The author and audience may have drastically different attitudes toward the subject, and it's the author's job in composing a text to try and get that audience's attitude to shift, even maybe just a little bit, into alignment with the author's attitude. In the next video in this series, we'll explore the concept of texts having form and content, and how we can be sure to distinguish between a text's content and its subject. For now, however, if you're interested, you can try this practice exercise. Think about yourself watching this video and identify the components of the rhetorical situation in which you are participating at this very moment.